As we talked about in chapter 1, all living organisms are made up of the same particles as non-living organisms, right? You remember the levels of organization from atoms to molecules to macromolecules and until we reach cells and so on. Well, you could actually continue dividing it into the other side. So atoms are made up of something as well. And in this chapter, we're going to look at the structure of atoms and the structure of molecules in order to be able to understand how living things are structured and why they behave the way that they behave. All living organisms, as well as non-living organisms, are made up of matter. Matter is like the stuff of the universe. Matter has mass and it occupies space. And matter is generally composed of atoms. So let's look at what atoms are. There are over 100 different types of atoms that make up the universe. And in order for us humans to be able to think about the atoms and talk about them, we've organized all of the atoms that we know of into a chart, the periodic table of elements. And the atoms there are arranged by size, which consequently means that they're arranged by property as well. This particular periodic table of elements has also been color-coded in order to show groups of atoms that have different properties. And we do not, in this class, need to worry about any of that. So the colors here do not matter. What you need to know is that each box represents one type of atom, which is also to say that it represents one chemical element. So saying one variety of atom or one kind of atom is the same as saying one chemical element. And what that means is that if a substance is made up of only one kind of atom, it has particular properties. So let's say we have a pure gold ring, and that ring reflects light a certain way, it melts at a certain temperature, and it interacts with other substances in a very specific way. If you were to take that ring and chop it up into small pieces of gold, they still would all melt at the same temperature, reflect light the same way, and they would still interact with other types of atoms in the same way. And you can keep chopping that gold ring until you get pieces, theoretically, that are only one atom in size. And even if you have one atom of gold, so one unit, the smallest unit you can get of gold, it will still reflect light and interact with other molecules in the same way than when it was a part of a ring. However, if you take that gold atom and divide it even more, then those tinier units will no longer act like gold in any situation. So an atom is the smallest unit that still has all the properties of that particular atom type, or it still has all the properties of that element. Here is an enlarged view of the smallest atom, and that is the hydrogen atom. Hydrogen atoms are really tiny, and what I want to point out here is that there are 4 pieces of information in each of the box that represents an element that you need to be aware of. Atomic number of hydrogen, so the atomic number of this particular chemical element. What that means, we will talk about in a second, but it's a very important number. And notice how you go down the row and across, the numbers, the atomic numbers of the elements increase. The second thing that you see in the square is the big letter H, and that is the symbol for this particular chemical element, which is hydrogen. and all of the chemical symbols are represented by 1 or 2 Latin letters. The third important piece of information here is the full name of this chemical element. And again, when I say chemical element, it means atom type. So it says hydrogen. And finally, at the bottom is present the atomic mass of this particular chemical element. Out of the 90 naturally occurring elements in the universe, only 12 are found in any substantial amounts in living organisms. And interestingly, only 4 chemical elements, so that means only 4 different types of atoms, make up 96% of the human body. And this ratio is actually true for most living things, give or take a little bit. 96% of most organisms is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And I do want you to remember this. I will ask you, what are the 4 elements or 4 atom types that make up the vast majority of living organisms? Some elements are found in living organisms in tiny amounts, and they're called trace elements. Although they are found in such small amounts, they are extremely important to the function of a human or any other organism. So we often have to take vitamins or eat certain food in order to ensure that we have the exact right amount of these trace elements. So now we know that there are over 100 different kinds of atoms. 90 of them are naturally occurring. 4 of them make up most living organisms. Okay, so what is the structure of an atom? And how are atoms different? What makes a hydrogen atom different from an atom of gold? Okay, so the structure of all atoms does not matter which one from the table of elements it is basically the same. All atoms are made up of 3 main subatomic units. So it means tinier pieces that make up the atom. And the 3 are protons, neutrons, and electrons. I will tell you the very basics of these 3 subatomic particles. Protons have a mass of 1 dalton, just 1. You don't need to really worry about what that mass means, because we're going to compare things more than talk about them exactly. So proton has a mass of 1. It has a positive charge. So think of magnets and how magnets have like a positive and a negative magnetic end. This is not the same, but it's similar, and that analogy is good enough for our class. Has a positive charge that has a strength of 1. And again, these numbers are just so you can compare things. Protons reside in the very center of an atom, and the center is called a nucleus. The second subatomic particle is called a neutron, and neutrons have a mass of about 1 as well. So in size, they're very similar to protons. We'll just say they're the same for simplicity's sake in this class. They do not have a charge. They're neutral, thus their name neutrons. And they too reside in the middle of an atom. Protons and neutrons are both clumped very closely in the center of an atom. In other words, in the nucleus of an atom. Okay. The third subatomic particle is called an electron. Electrons have a very, very tiny mass, almost 1/2000th of the mass of the other particles. So we're not even going to count their mass in any sense, because it's so small that it doesn't make a difference in any of the math we're going to do. But what we need to know is that although they are teeny tiny, Electrons have a negative charge of -1. That means that the strength of the charge of one electron is the same, although opposite, as the charge of one proton. And electrons reside on the outskirts, outside of the center of the atom. It is common for science books in chemistry and biology to demonstrate the structure of an atom like this diagram B at the bottom. They show the nucleus, or the center part of an atom in the center, and then they draw electrons orbiting around the nucleus. This is a nice way to visualize the structure of an atom. It is far from accurate in two main ways. First is that although electrons do exist outside of the nucleus, they do not obediently and predictably circle the nucleus the way that planets circle the sun. In fact, electrons bounce all over the place outside of the nucleus, and according to the uncertainty principle in physics, we can never really guess or predict where the electron is going to be. So we say, more accurately, as depicted in A part of this diagram, the electrons are bouncing around like crazy in this electron cloud, kind of like the atmosphere full of bouncing gases that surrounds the Earth. The second reason why both diagram A and B are not accurate is because they're both extremely not to scale. The nucleus is so tiny that if we were to scale an average atom to be the same size as planet Earth, then the nucleus, so the center part that has the protons and the neutrons, would be the size of a standard football field somewhere on Earth. Or we could say if an average atom is the size of a football stadium, then the nucleus would be like a small marble in the center of the 50-meter line. So the electron cloud is by far the majority of the volume or the space of an atom, like practically all of it. The nucleus is really tiny, but it does have practically all the mass really densely located inside of it. The two examples here show the tiniest atom, hydrogen, which only has one proton inside of its nucleus, and it does not have any neutrons, and it has one electron bouncing around in that cloud unpredictably around the one proton. And the second example is oxygen, which has 8 protons in the nucleus, 8 neutrons in the nucleus, and a lot of times it has 8 electrons, though not always, bouncing crazy around and unpredictably in a cloud surrounding that nucleus. So if all of the atoms that make up the universe are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, what makes a hydrogen atom different than a gold atom or an oxygen atom? How can we say that there are over 100 different kinds of atoms if they're all made up of the same stuff? The most basic way to define a type of atom or an atom of each chemical element is by its atomic number. So if an atom has 1 proton inside of its nucleus, meaning it has the atomic number 1, then it is by definition a hydrogen atom. If an atom has 8 protons inside of its nucleus, which gives it atomic number 8, it is by definition an oxygen atom. So the number of protons inside of a nucleus of an atom define that atom as an atom of a particular chemical element. Atomic mass of an atom is actually quite difficult to calculate precisely. However, we don't need to be super precise. We're going to talk about the general idea. So obviously, if you add the mass of all the parts of an atom, you will get the atomic mass, or the total mass of that atom. However, since electrons have a really tiny mass, we don't really need to be adding them because they're going to add 0.00001, and that doesn't change it for our purposes in biology. So for us, the way that you calculate the mass of an atom is by adding the number of protons and the number of neutrons together. Since both a proton and a neutron have a mass of 1, it's pretty easy math. So if you know the number of protons, which you do always know because it's the atomic number, and you know the number of neutrons, you can add them together and get the mass of an atom. One proton has a mass of approximately 1 Dalton, or it's also called the universal atomic mass unit. We don't need to worry about that, but if you're curious about what that really means in comparison to things that you might be more familiar with, it's here for you. Also, if I give you the atomic mass, you should be able to tell me how many neutrons are in a particular kind of atom. So if I tell you that the atomic mass of oxygen is 16, then you know that by definition, oxygen has the atomic number 8. 16 minus 8 equals 8 neutrons, because the mass, as we calculated, is only made up of protons and neutrons. If you know the total mass and you know how many protons there are, which each have mass of 1, you can subtract that from the total and get the number of neutrons that are in the nucleus of that atom. I will not ask you to memorize any part of the periodic table. So if I have a question like this, I will tell you what the atomic number of an element I'm talking about is. Okay, so you do not need to memorize any of the numbers. You just need to understand how to calculate total mass. You need to understand that atomic number represents the number of protons, each of which have a mass of 1. And you need to understand how to calculate the number of neutrons if you have the total mass and the name of the element. Okay? So the number of protons defines what type of an atom it is, right? So that does not change. And I mentioned that the number of neutrons is generally the same as the number of protons, but they're not always the same. There are instances where different atoms of the same element have a different number of neutrons inside. So atoms that belong to the same element, therefore have the same atomic number, but happen to have different number of neutrons, are called isotopes of that element. I will demonstrate an example here. All carbon atoms in nature have 6 protons. That's what makes it a carbon atom. And most of the time, they also have 6 neutrons and even 6 electrons, but we will not talk about electrons for now. However, a small fraction that is predictable and calculatable of all carbon atoms in the universe actually have 7 neutrons. And yet a smaller fraction of all carbon atoms have 8 neutrons. So there are 3 isotopes of carbon atoms. The isotope that has 8 neutrons has a name. It's called carbon-14. Can you guess why carbon-14? Pause this video for a second if you're thinking. If you have already guessed or you don't want to be thinking about it, then I will tell you it is because of the total mass of that particular atom is 14. Well, carbon-14 is unstable. Another way to say that, it's radioactive. And what that means is that sticking that many neutrons into that center part of an atom crowded together with the protons, it's just not stable. Like, they fit there for a little while, but eventually it's gonna fall apart. What it means to be a radioactive atom is that over time, the nucleus, so that center part of the atom, is gonna break apart and become different. And this is a nuclear reaction. And when an unstable nucleus breaks apart, it emits a huge amount of energy, radiation. Just because a particular isotope is unstable and radioactive does not mean it just like breaks apart immediately. Unstable radioactive isotope of uranium breaks apart little by little only after millions of years,